We're joined right now on RealAgriculture.com by Mark Lawton. He is the Technology Development Lead for Eastern Canada with Monsanto. Welcome today, Mark.
Thanks, Sean.
Mark, I got a press release back in May 4th, University of Guelph. They've identified glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane in Essex County. What is the significance of this?
Well, I think for obviously for those few farmers who are involved, this is an issue where glyphosate will no longer be effective at controlling that specific weed. There are alternative solutions that are currently registered that we're recommending that they can use to manage that on their farm.
So do you see this, I guess, last year you had mentioned before that we had ragweed identified last year. Do you see this this trend kind of continuing, or is there only a certain amount of weeds that we really think will open themselves up to glyphosate resistance?
Well, I think globally, Sean, we've seen several weeds become resistant to glyphosate in different agricultural situations. It could be in an annual crop or more perennial crops like trees or pastures. And one of the things we've been looking for is its presence in Canada, and researchers have been looking for many years. And it's just in the past year or two that we've discovered the presence of glyphosate resistance, first in giant ragweed in the same geographic area in Ontario, as well as now Canada fleabane through some of the field work the University of Guelph has completed.
So is there certain why Essex County?
Good question. I think one of the things we've learned from the other global situations is understanding the agronomic practices that might predispose the development of glyphosate resistance, and we've sort of taken those learnings and incorporate them into some of the stewardship recommendations that we talk about with Roundup use and glyphosate use and the use of Roundup-ready crops. And it's there's some pretty simple things farmers can do to insulate themselves from the risk. Things like just using good agronomic practices. So starting clean and staying clean from a weed control standpoint. Using the right rate at the right time with glyphosate. That where that hasn't been followed, sometimes resistance issues have occurred, and just ensuring you have diversity in your crop production program over several years. So that can include different crops, different herbicide strategies. May include tillage. I think where you're reliant on a single crop and a single weed management strategy, that's where the risk can elevate. And the good news is that the vast majority of producers, both in Eastern Canada and Western Canada, follow good agronomic practices with crop rotation and with different herbicide strategies. And that's probably one of the primary reasons why we haven't had a glyphosate resistance issue or concern here in Canada.
So when we say we've identified glyphosate-resistant fleabane,
right?
Are we saying we have found 5 plants in a field, or are we saying we're seeing it's really prevalent?
No, these are small pockets within fields. So we have a service through the University of Guelph, just like occurs in some of the academic institutions in Western Canada, where farmers can send in samples of weeds that they want to check for resistance to glyphosate or any other herbicide. And so some of these sites that we've identified, these 8 locations, came from just farmers sending in samples, as they do every year, looking for resistance assessments. We've also been collaborating with the University of Guelph just on some graduate student research looking at the resistance discovery with giant ragweed from a couple years ago, and looking at weed management strategies, and continuing to sort of survey fields looking for a distribution of some of these resistant populations. And we're able to pick up a few fleabane populations or samples from that survey, and some of those also turned out positive when we screened them in the greenhouse at some sort of discretionary rates, I guess, of glyphosate that are used.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? Are we going to be? I guess. Obviously there is changing. Working on changing groups and better rotations and agronomic practices. Are we eventually going to see a new generation glyphosate, or like how do we deal with this?
Well, I think some things we're focused on. So one is increasing our communication around our stewardship recommendations. So the good agronomic practices that farmers should be following that will really prevent the glyphosate resistant issue from occurring on their farm. We've also introduced in this past year a new online tool. It's called weedtool.com, and there's a version for Western Canada and for Eastern Canada where farmers can answer 10 pretty straightforward questions about their farm practice with their individual farm, and it gives them an assessment of their risk or probability of having glyphosate resistance developing. It's actually a program that was created in collaboration with academics in Western Canada and Eastern Canada, where they identified the questions and the answers and rated the risks of each of the questions and answers to glyphosate resistance from occurring. And that's been popular, and I would suggest to producers that are concerned about that seek that out. And I think that the third thing from our end is just innovating for the future. And one of our focus areas is in next generation herbicide tolerant systems in crops like corn and soybeans and canola. And in soybeans, interestingly enough, one that we've been working on for several years in Canada is a dicamba tolerant soybean. And we're still a few years away from registration and commercialization of that technology, but that new strategy for weed management in soybeans has actually worked very, very well on these resistant glyphosate-resistant populations of giant ragweed, and we'll continue to field test that on fleabane as well this upcoming year.
So are there any other weeds that are kind of on the research radar in terms of being concerned about glyphosate tolerance?
Well, there's a sort of a global list. Some of those also occur in Canada. I think the Canada fleabane was one we had been expecting, and so it's not a surprise to see it here. It has a fairly wide distribution in the U.S. and is in Michigan and Ohio, which is in close proximity to Ontario. I think in Western Canada, the discovery of some kosher resistance was from the American Midwest is one we're watching and paying attention to from a Western Canada standpoint. There's been some other broadleaf species in the U.S. that occur in Eastern Canada that we're keeping an eye on. But I think the important message is that farmers need to pay attention to the stewardship recommendations we're making. Making sure they've got diversity in their system, and when they choose to use Roundup or other glyphosates, that they're doing that at the appropriate rate at the appropriate time, and following those simple strategies, which a lot of producers do, just at a good agronomic practice, will ensure glyphosate in the Roundup Ready cropping system will be sustainable for many years to come.
So, Mark, what makes a weed more prone to glyphosate tolerance? It's a prevalent weed that's continually getting sprayed by glyphosate, or what makes it that way?
Yeah, I think the theory is there's a just from a diversity of a population that there's there's probably resistance ones that always exist. Then it just becomes a matter of a selection process. And obviously, if you use the same approach, same herbicide approach year after year after year with no other diversity in your herbicide program, then those types of populations will get selected out of that that wild population and become more prevalent. With glyphosate, the presence of that resistance is a lot lower frequency than some other herbicide family groups, like Group 1s and Group 2s, for instance, where some of that those resistance populations have been selected much quicker at a field scale. But it can happen with glyphosate as well over a longer period of time, and it's really a selection process from a numbers game. It's just that the selection timeline and the numbers are a lot lower. There's a lot lower probability of a glyphosate resistance occurring than to other herbicide families, but it can occur, and I think we've seen that over the past 15 years, and in different types of cropping systems, whether they're plantations or trees or pastures, or in row crop production in North America and elsewhere in the world.
Okay, Mark. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll talk to you again soon in the future.
Thanks for your time, Sean.